And I grew up on Long Island, and I came to upstate New York to go to college, and then came to Syracuse for a job, and I've been here ever since 1972. So this is really home now.
Uh-huh. You were active politically, or?
I was, but more on the fringes, I think. I actually grew up in a family, my parents were very active politically, and unlike probably a lot of people of my age, I didn't have to rebel against my family because they've always been sort of left-leaning, still are for that matter. My parents are both still alive, and they'll be 83 this year, so that's sort of been how my history came up. And I marched on Washington a couple of times during the Vietnam War, and then subsequently for abortion rights. But I wouldn't describe myself as at the forefront of anything politically. Just there.
Uh-huh. But you ended up going to the peace camp.
I did. It was, I was curious about it, and in the circle that I hung out with here at Info, I mean, people were politically active, and one of my friends had actually gone to the peace camp. I think she went to the peace camp with the intent of getting arrested, and I took her kids for that day so that she didn't have to worry about where they were and what was going on with them. So at some point I decided that I wanted to go for myself and see what was going on out there, so I did.
So she knew that she was going to go to the camp, and she asked you to keep her
kids.
And
yeah.
so did she end up getting arrested?
She did.
And was she back that night, or did you take her? Okay.
Yep. It was a pretty quick, they were, I think, pretty efficient at it at that point in terms of arresting people who did civil disobedience and then letting them out pretty quickly.
So do you remember, so when the children were going to be with you, you pretty much thought she'd be back that night? It's not like you had to think about, what if something happened and they were here for days?
I wasn't really worried about it. I mean, either way, I was comfortable with her kids, and obviously she was comfortable with me leaving them with me. I just remember that it was very early in the morning when she came over, and had these sleepy kids, so.
Dropped off. And do you remember at all, did they know what was going on? Were they
I don't think so. They were pretty little. My kids, when the peace camp was first starting, were probably 5 and 1 or 6 and 2, and hers were of comparable ages, so we were talking about toddlers, really.
Coming over to hang out, that's all.
Yeah.
Nice.
So did she, when she got back, was she excited about what she had done?
Yeah, and I suppose in some way I had an envy, because to make that much of a commitment, but I was certainly more conservative in some ways, and getting arrested was not something that I was particularly interested in. I'd be the person to be there to bail somebody out rather than the person behind the bars.
Takes everybody.
Yeah,
that's right. But eventually you made a decision to go
right
for yourself.
I think I went 2 separate times. One time there was a march, and I'm trying to think what the specific occasion was. We marched from, I can't think of, do you know the name of what the closest town was?
Romulus, Geneva, Seneca Falls,
no,
Waterloo.
It was Waterloo, that was it. And we marched from Waterloo, through Waterloo to the peace encampment. And it was a very peaceful march. I mean, the police were there, but to keep people, to stop the traffic for us. And what made the big impression on me that day was that the wife of the bank president in Waterloo came and joined the march. And that seemed important, you know, that because Wolcott's a pretty small town and it was pretty conservative, and the area around the peace encampment was a conservative area, and I thought that the fact that probably one of the elite of the town actually came and joined the march, I thought that that was very telling in terms of what was happening in the country at that time.
How did you know that she was a part of it?
I think the word passed through the crowd, nothing like the way exciting news like that can pass through.
You just know it.
Yeah.
And so you remember marching
through
town on the way to somewhere?
On the way to the peace encampment. We marched to the peace encampment, and I think that was probably the first time that I went. And I was there just for the day, for the afternoon. And I can't even remember who I went with that time.
So your kids were with somebody?
Yeah, I think my kids were probably with their dad. It was not something I certainly have no problem with bringing kids to marches. I have done it, at other times when they were older, but this was more for me. And so it was a chance to be away from my kids.
And other than the bank wife, is there any, do you remember any impressions of the other people there, or the encampment? Nothing?
No,
doesn't stand out.
I remember walking over a bridge and just that sort of general sense of camaraderie that you get in that type of situation.
And had you been on marches with your parents, if they were liberal leaning, or?
Yes, actually, probably the first one that I went was a civil rights march in Washington when Martin Luther King did his I Have a Dream speech. And I was 63, so I guess I was 13. Is that the right year, do you know? I think that's right. And my brother was 3 years younger than I was, so my parents decided that it was important to go, but they thought that my brother was too young, so I think they flipped a coin as to who would go and who would stay behind. And my mother and I went down on a train with a whole group of people from Long Island, and it was great. I mean, the train from New York City to Washington, took a few hours, and we sang songs, and it was really a wonderful experience. And I remember dressing up for the march. I mean, I wore a skirt and a blouse, even though it was hot, really, really hot. But it was my parents' feeling that it was important to show to the world that marches weren't just people that they might define as being on the fringe, but so-called, middle Americans too. And so we didn't dress down, we dressed up. And so we went down and we took the train down to Washington, and we walked from the train station to the Lincoln Memorial, and friends of ours were there too. I mean, we knew other people who came, and we had a picnic lunch and, hung out in the crowds and listened to the speeches, took a nap in the hot sun, and then got back on the train and went back. That was probably my first experience of, marching for some sort of social issue, and that was definitely all my parents doing.
And did was that unusual for your circle of friends, or did they have families that were politically active too?
Oh no, this was pretty unusual. I grew up in East Meadow, Long Island, Westbury, Long Island, and my parents had friends. I mean, some of our friends who were neighbors also came, but I think it was pretty unusual in our neighborhood for anybody to be that way. I mean, we were definitely the black sheep of the neighborhood, if you will.
Yeah. Cool.
So
So that the first time that you were at Seneca was the Waterloo March, and
Yeah.
do you remember anything about the second time?
The second time I went for a weekend, and I went with a friend of mine, Gretchen, and we were planning to stay at the encampment, but there was no room at the inn, so to speak. So we ended up going to the park, the state park that's there, Sampson, I think it's called. And my friend was a camper, so we were very well prepared for whatever was going to happen. So we spent the day at the Peace Encampment and then spent the night at Sampson and then came back the next day. And it's funny, I remember walking around the Peace Encampment and I remember looking at a lot of photos and probably seeing some people, other people that I knew, but I don't remember doing anything exactly, just being there. But there were two things that happened that weekend when I was there that really I do remember very well, that made an impression. One was we were sitting on the front lawn of the house where the Peace Encampment was, and we were just sitting down, again it was summer and it was hot, and a car drove by and somebody threw a cup of liquid at us. And I remember sort of holding my breath because we didn't know what it was. And so there was no way we could move, it just happened so quickly. And it was soda. So it was, a pain because hot, sticky soda on a hot day. But I thought, boy, it could have been anything. I mean, we didn't know what was going to happen. And that was the only time that I had any sense of fear or anxiety or anything. It just seemed like a peaceful place other than that. And I think it was just some clown who thought it was funny, I don't think it was necessarily somebody who was trying to do any harm to us, or obviously they could have thrown something much worse than soda. But it was very unpleasant, and it made me very uncomfortable. That was sort of okay, could be serious stuff. And the other thing that happened on one of those days was that a local group from, I think it was probably a veterans organization, came, and they wanted to give a flag, an American flag, to the Women's Peace Encampment. And I don't know who was in charge. I don't know who was organizing or whatever, but the decision was made to not accept it. And I was very sorry that they didn't accept the flag because, well, for two reasons. First of all, because I think it was offered out of a good place. I don't think it was a test. It didn't feel like that. And the second thing is that when we're trying to make a statement, I mean, I live in this country, this is my flag, and I've always felt I don't want the people who are in favor of war to be the ones who think that they own the flag. And if I accept a flag or if I display a flag or whatever, people could make a certain assumption about me, but I always know where I'm coming from. And I know that there were other women there who felt the same way I did, and I think that was an issue that caused a lot of stress. I don't think that turning away the flag was done lightly. I think there was a lot of conversation about it. I wasn't part of it, but I was very sorry because I think that it set up some negative feelings that wouldn't have been there. I had the feeling that the surrounding community was pretty accepting of the encampment.
So you remember being there while these people came up to offer them? You remember seeing that? Mm-hmm. And then the discussion happened. It's not like they invited everybody who was there to discuss it. You
No.
just knew it was happening.
Right,
And so then before you left to go home, they had decided not to take it.
right.
And at the time, you thought that wasn't...
Not a good
It's like
idea.
not a good idea. And do you
Yeah.
remember thinking if there were anybody else that felt that way? I mean,
I'm
discussed it?
pretty sure that there
Oh.
were. And, maybe I wasn't there when it happened. I know that did happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was the weekend that I was there. But I did have pretty strong feelings about it, but not strong enough that I was going to get up and jump and and yell. I'll take it.
Yeah, there you go. And do you remember at the time thinking that there were nuclear weapons at that depot?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Really?
I was sure that there were.
And was it something you just knew from being in Syracuse for a little bit years
Yeah,
before?
and reading things, and I can't remember when they said that they did confirm that they were there, but
Later, yeah.
I think it was that the general feeling was that, yeah, they were there.
And was that something at that time, the early 80s, was nuclear war something that you were concerned about as a possibility, or is it more theoretical?
I don't know that I really looked on it as a possibility. Maybe I still have a Pollyanna-ish twist, but I would like to think that nobody in our government or in any government would be stupid enough to use a nuclear bomb again. I mean, I know we were once. But I do think that if they're around, the potential is there for somebody to make a decision. And certainly the potential for an accident is there. I mean, we know that from the nuclear accidents that have happened at power plants. And I don't know enough about the technology to be able to say that the radiation, the radioactive material that's in a bomb or a warhead is more or less stable than that at a power plant. But I mean, I think we all live with danger around us all the time, and if we really thought about it all too much, I don't know how we get out of bed in the mornings. So, but it was something that I was concerned about, but I also knew that it was something that I really had no control over. I am of the age that we did those silly tests in schools where, we'd go out in the hall and sit down in the floor and cover up our heads or get under desks. And when I was growing up on Long Island, there were places that sold bomb shelters and people who actually bought them. I mean, I don't know anybody who did, but
Yeah,
I
they
remember
were.
seeing them, and I certainly knew enough to know that in the event of a nuclear detonation, I mean, there's nowhere to hide. So to worry about it in sort of an avid sense just didn't make any sense to me. That's, again, out of my control.
How did your husband feel about you going to the women's encampment?
Oh, he was fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, that wasn't,
It
I mean,
wasn't
he
an
would have
issue.
gone too if it was, a politically correct thing for a man to go. And I know that some men did go, but in general. But we had gone on peace marches to Washington together, and so,
So no reservations about a women's only action.
no.
Did that
No.
seem unusual to you that there'd be a women only action, or had you heard of them before?
Well, let's see, when did I was involved with info before my kids were born. And I went down to Washington for a women's only action at the Pentagon, where we surrounded the Pentagon, took it hostage, so to speak. And so, no, it wasn't anything unusual to me, unusual to him. It was just,
Right. And how old are your children now?
30 and 26.
And
Actually, almost 31.
wow, that doesn't seem possible. But so later, did you do actions that you took your children to?
Trying to think. Yes, actually, local ones here. I mean, there have been a few marches here in Syracuse, and my kids, my nieces came too, and we spent the morning making posters, doing arts and crafts. My parents were in town for that too, so it was a big family affair down at in the downtown. And one memory I have, and this is what I was thinking of when I came up the steps here at Info, in the August before my younger daughter was born, so that would be 1981, Info and Now did a joint march from downtown to the Women's Information Center for women's rights in August on the anniversary of the amendment, I guess, for women to vote. And I was 8 months pregnant at the time, so I didn't march. And my husband and my daughter did. And I stayed here and helped make food for the people when they came up. And I remember waiting on the porch for people to arrive. So,
That's great.
so no, women-only actions felt very normal.
Mm-hmm. And are either of your children, what are they like politically in terms of awareness and social?
They're both politically aware. They're not activists, but you could still get them out to a peace rally if it was like, okay, the whole family's going to go type of thing. My older daughter is back in school. She's in graduate school now, getting her PhD in math education.
Nice.
And my younger daughter's a newspaper reporter, so she tries pretty carefully to stay neutral officially on things, because it's what you need to do to be able to do your job correctly, or people aren't going to talk to you. But they're both still pretty active, and their dad is one of the regular writer of letters to the editor locally, so
Nice.
they've had the experience of saying, aren't you Rick Olenoff's daughter? Isn't it your dad who writes letters all the time? So we're divorced now, by the way. So.
And did you at the time, or do you now, consider yourself a feminist?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And I would consider my daughters feminists, and I would consider my ex-husband a feminist, and my parents, and pretty much everybody that I would call a friend.
Did you have any other things you wanted to, memories that you wanted to
I
talk about?
don't. I mean, when Susie called me, I started thinking about, the peace encampment, and actually, as strange as it seems, the flag thing only came to me yesterday. Getting hit with the soda and the march with the banker's wife, I remembered first. So I think it's too bad that there aren't more marches now.
Yeah.
Marches for what?
Against the war in Iraq. I think we're in a very bad situation in this country, and a not particularly good one in the world. And I'm hopeful that a Democrat will get elected, but I'm not very hopeful that it will necessarily mean too much. But I certainly, personally, don't think that John McCain will do anything good for this country. So,
And like some other feminists, is it a difficult thing for you that you have Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton?
It isn't really. I voted for Obama in the primary here in New York. I like Hillary well enough, but the fact that she supported Bush in the war vote really just, on some level, that's very hard for me to get around. If she is the candidate, I will vote for her, and I voted for her for senator, and I would probably vote for her again, but I'm not sure that I have too much faith in anybody who could get elected president. I mean, I think to get to that point, that there's got to be so much compromise. That part of me is pretty realistic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always hopeful, but
No Pollyanna there. Okay.
no. I think that I hope that things get resolved sooner rather than later, because I really don't like the polarization that I'm seeing. And I think that both Obama and Clinton are decent people, and I don't want one side or the other to, go away mad, and certainly don't go away and vote for John McCain. I can't even imagine. I could imagine going away and not voting, which I think is not a good thing. And I know people who don't vote, who purposely don't vote because they think that it's sort of useless. I personally, as soon as I was old enough to vote, started voting, and have a history of voting probably for a long line of losers, but
You're going to vote nonetheless.
my family's theory is if you don't vote, you're not allowed to complain, and I never want to give up my right to complain, so